Welcome to the CSS3 project training series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're going to talk about gradients in CSS3. CSS3 gradients let you display smooth transitions between two or more specified colors using just CSS. In earlier versions of CSS, you had to use images for these effects. However, by using CSS3 gradients, you can reduce download time and bandwidth usage. In addition, elements with gradients look better when zoomed because the gradient's generated by the browser itself and it's not part of a graphic. So the changes in the gradients in CSS3 is really phenomenal for our browsers. CSS3 defines two types of gradients. We have linear gradients, which goes down, up, left, right, and diagonally. And we have radial gradients, which are defined by their center, and they actually go from the center out. Browser support for gradients. For the linear gradient, it was available in Internet Explorer 10, Chrome 26. We could actually use the WebKit prefix in Chrome 10.0. It was available in 16.0 in Firefox, 6.1 in Safari, and 12.1 in Opera. And you can see, looking at this chart, when the radial gradient and the repeating linear and the repeating radial were available throughout the most popular browsers that we're currently using in our web development. So let's go ahead and dive into the development environment and demonstrate what we've been discussing about gradients in CSS3. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of the presentation and move into our development environment. I want to confirm that I've got my Apache server is up and running, which it is. I'm going to bring up my Opera browser, which is the browser I'll be using for this demonstration, and Sublime Text 2, which will be my text editor. I've got my CSS3_start file loaded. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as example_1.html in our gradients folder. So CSS3 linear gradients. To create a linear gradient, you must define at least two color stops. Color stops are the colors you want to render smooth transitions among. You can also set a starting point and a direction or an angle along with gradient effects. And we're actually going to go through all these as we go through these demonstrations. There'll be quite a few demonstrations in this particular lab exercise. I do want to make you aware that the WebKit prefix is for Safari. That's the Safari rendering engine. The O prefix is for the Opera rendering engine. The MOZ prefix is Firefox Mozilla. And the MS obviously is Internet Explorer for Microsoft. I will be actually putting those prefixes in some of our styling so that we can actually address some of the other browsers that currently don't support all the features in the gradients that are changing in CSS3. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and add some code to our HTML body. I'm going to go ahead and save these changes to my example_1 file. Good time to pause if you want to type these in. And this first example is going to be a top to bottom gradient. The linear gradient starts at the top and it starts light, and it's going to be a light blue and it's going to transition to a light green. You'll see that when we put the styles in. I'm going to go ahead and add the styles into the head section of our document. And you'll see I've got my opening and closing style tags. Let me go ahead and clean this up a little bit because we're going to actually keep these style tags throughout. You'll notice now I've given my grade 1, my ID of gradient 1, which you'll see that I've given the div an ID of gradient 1. I've assigned it a height, so we actually have a height to this gradient. Then I've set my background, WebKit linear gradient. The linear gradient, by the way, is the property that we're actually identifying, and the values are my starting color and my stop color in hexadecimal values. I'm going to go ahead and save all those changes. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that in. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my browser window. Let's go back and make sure we've got example 1 loaded. Refresh our browser window. Now you can actually see that linear gradient starting with that light blue and transitioning to a light green at the bottom. And it's all done now strictly from CSS. There are no graphics involved with doing this. This makes it so much better than it was in previous versions of CSS, where we actually had to use GIFs or just images to transition these, and we'd actually stack them and repeat them across the page. And it became quite intense when you were creating gradient backgrounds. Now we can actually do it just by actually using the linear gradient properties in CSS3 and assigning them our start and stop values. All right, so I want to do another demonstration. This one's going to be a linear gradient. Instead of going from top to bottom, this one's going to go from left to right to give you an idea of some of the variables that we can actually put in here to do these. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. I want to save this as example underscore 2.html. This is so that you'll have access to all these files if you do have the exercise files. I'm going to go ahead and remove our existing code. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all the code that we currently have in there. And I'm going to remove the HTML. And I'm going to go into my exercise files. I'm going to grab a new set of HTML code. This linear gradient is going to go from left to right. And you'll notice I've got my H1, basically has my CSS3 gradients, linear gradient left to right. This linear gradient starts at the left. It starts with our light blue and transitions to our light green, similar to the previous exercise, but instead of going top to bottom, it's going to go left to right. And again, I've changed my ID this time to gradient instead of using the grad 1. Let me go ahead and scroll up. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that in. I'm going to go ahead and put the styling now inside our style tags, which is in the head section of our document. And we'll talk about these in 1 minute. Let me just go ahead and put these in place again. Again, I'm using my height to actually give some content area to my div element. You'll notice I'm using the ID gradient and I'm assigning it up here gradient. I'm giving it a height of 200 pixels. And then once again, we're using our prefixes, our WebKit, our O and our MOS. And then we're using our linear gradient. And I'm saying you're starting from the left. That's why you'll see that left keyword or the left value, comma, and then my start color and my stop color. And again, I'm using the hexadecimal equivalents, same colors that we used in the previous exercise. I'm going to go ahead and save all those changes. I want to go back and load example number 2. And you see now that we're actually transitioning from the left to the right. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that in. But you'll notice this linear gradient starts at the left. We're starting with the light blue at the left based on the left keyword that we used in the values. We're starting with the light blue and we're transitioning to that light green. And again, it's so much nicer now that we can do this inside CSS and we're not required to use all the images that we had to use in previous versions of CSS. All right, so now I'd like to go ahead and demonstrate a diagonal gradient. Again, works very similar to what we've been doing. I'm going to do save as. Let's save this as example underscore 3.html. And I want to remove the existing code we have here because we're going to basically start from scratch. So get rid of my HTML. I'll leave in my heading because I think I saved the heading on all of mine. Let's go ahead and load HTML3 or example underscore 3 for our CSS3 gradients. I'm going to go ahead and grab my HTML text. Let's go ahead and put that into our text editor. And you notice now I've got a linear gradient diagonal. I'm going to take out some of these blank lines. This linear gradient starts at the bottom left corner. It starts with our light red, transitioning to the top right with a light blue. And again, this is going to be a diagonal gradient. It's actually going to go from the bottom left corner all the way to the top right corner. And that's how it's going to fade across. Good time to pause if you want to type that in. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the browser to bring that stuff into play. Oops, I got to save the changes first, then I can refresh the browser. There we go. And bring that into play. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and grab the styling up inside the head section of my document. I'm going to go ahead and put in the styling. I'll make sure you get a chance to pause this in 1 second. Let me go ahead and get it cleaned up first. Take out some of these blank lines, and I'm going to go ahead and expand this so we don't have the broken line. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in. You'll notice I've set a height of 200 pixels again for that gradient div that we've created. And again, I'm using my prefixes for WebKit, O, and Mozilla. I've got my linear gradient, but you'll notice I've actually added now left bottom, top right, and it says in the linear gradient it's to top right. This is the one we're actually going to be using, by the way, because we're not using, I don't need the prefixes for the current browser I'm using, but it's going to my top right corner. This is my starting color, my ending color, and it's going to go to the top right. So I'm going to go ahead and save all those changes. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my browser window, and you'll notice now we've started with this red in the bottom left, and it's transitioning to the blue in that top right based on the color stops that we've put in there. And again, so much nicer now that we can do this using CSS instead of having to work with all the graphics that we've had to work with in the past. The next thing I think we're going to do is I'd like to demonstrate how we can use angles to do this also. Because not only can we do this the way we've been doing it, top to bottom, left to right, bottom to top, right to left, and corner to corner. We can actually use angles to do these now, so we can get our gradients to work in almost any degree in a 360-degree circle. And that's going to be our next demonstration. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as example number _4.html. And I'm going to go ahead and pull out our styling. I'm going to go ahead and pull out the HTML that we had in the previous example. Because now what I'd like to do, again, I want to do a linear gradient using angles. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my HTML code. And let's go ahead right below that H1 and put this in place. And again, linear gradient using angles. In this gradient demonstration, we'll use an angle to determine how the gradient's displayed. This gives you much more control over the gradients and how they appear on the page. And again, it's going to start with our light red transitioning to the top right light blue. This is the diagonal gradient, but we're going to actually base this now. This gradient is going to be based on angles, and we're actually going to see how I can actually change these as we're doing this. Let me go ahead and take out some of these blank lines. Good time to pause if you want to type that in. I'm going to go ahead and grab the styling. I'm going to scroll up on my page. Let's go ahead and put this in our style tags. I'll go ahead and clean this up again so that you can get it typed in your document. I'll talk you through this in 1 second. Let me go ahead and save these changes. Good time to pause if you want to type that in. First thing I want to do is I want to go ahead out here and refresh. I want to go load number 4, and you'll see now that I've got this standard 180 degree. This is actually going from the bottom to the top. I'm using my light blue and transitioning to red. But what's cool when we start working now with these angles is we can get very precise. If I wanted this to be 90 degrees, so I'm just going to go and update all of these to 90 degrees. And keep in mind now, 90 degrees should be based on how we look at a clock. We should actually view this left to right. So I'm going to save that change, refresh my browser window, and now you're seeing we're going left to right because we're actually going pointing 90 degrees. 0 would be up, 90 degrees would be right, 180 would be down, 270 would be left. So if I were to make this 270, it should reverse it. So I can take out the 90, I can put in 270. And again, the only one we're really using is the bottom one, but I'm updating all of these. In the event that you're doing this across multiple browsers and you want to be compliant with older versions of the browsers, I'm going to save those changes, refresh the browser, now it just reverses. Because again, we've reversed the angle. But what's really cool about using degrees, I can actually make this anything I want. If I wanted this 27 degrees, I could save that change, refresh my browser window, and now it's 27 degrees. So we're actually coming some here, somewhere up in this range would be 27 degrees. Because we know that this is 90, this is 0, this is 90, so I've got 45 somewhere in the center, and that would be somewhere around there would be 27. And that's actually what we're doing now. We can actually make this anything that we wanted it to be. If I wanted it 45, I could make them 45. I could change my degrees to 45 degrees. And again, by saving the changes, refreshing the browser window, it changes the angle of my linear gradient. Really, really cool stuff being able to do this by actually using degrees themselves. It gives you so much more flexibility when you're actually working with these linear gradients. And gradients are used a lot. There's a lot of different things that we do with gradients. And again, you could use these any colors that you want. I'm just happen to pick these colors. I could make these anything I wanted to make them. I could make them black to white if I wanted to. I could just change this 0, 0, 0. Actually, let's undo it there. Let's just change it on the one that we're actually using. So I could say 0, 0, 0 to FFF. Save the change, refresh the browser window, and now we're going from a black to a white. Because I mean, we can do these gradients now any way that we want using any colors that we want. So it's very, very cool, the stuff that we can do now with all the different capabilities of the linear gradient inside CSS3. All right, so one of the other things I want to demonstrate, because there's going to be times when you're going to want to have more than 2 colors or more than 2 color stops in your gradient. And that's also possible with the new gradient features in CSS3. So in the next exercise, we're going to demonstrate multiple color stops for our gradient. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Save this as _5.html. Now what I want to do is let's go ahead and pull out our HTML code. I'm going to go ahead and pull out my styling because that's going to change. Let's go ahead and add this new multiple color stops, HTML. Go ahead and paste this in. And again, all we're doing here is we're adding multiple color stops inside of our gradient. I'm going to go ahead and save the change. Good time to pause if you want to type that in. Then go back here, refresh. Let's go ahead and load up number 5. Now I want to go ahead and add the styling for our multiple stops. I'm going to come up here in the style tags of my head section. Go ahead and clean this up a little bit. And I'll give you a chance to type this in. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that in. The key, what I want you to notice here though, is that I've got 3 different color stops. I'm actually going from one color to a center color to a transition color. So I'm actually going to transition 3 different colors in this particular example. So I'm transitioning from my green to my red, it's almost like a pink, to a light blue. And you'll notice they all seem to transition across. It's almost like they're blurred together. And that's what that linear gradient does. It actually brings them all together. I've had up to 7 different color stops inside these linear gradients without any issues at all. I've not been able to locate the limit of the colors that are available for linear gradients, but I know that I've personally myself have used up to 7. Haven't seen any problems with it. I'm not certain what the value is, if there is a limit at all. I mean, I'm certain there has to be a limit somewhere for no other reason, just because you wouldn't be able to transition the colors anymore. But I have not found one inside the specification. I continue to look. So the next thing I want to do, let's look at using transparencies with our gradients in CSS3. And I hope you understand that this is very cool. I mean, being able to do this now inside CSS3 is so much better than it was just a year ago, a few short years ago, when we were having to do all this with graphics and then loading the graphics into our pages. Okay, so next I want to look at using transparencies with our colors and our gradients. So I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as example_6.html. And I want to go ahead and remove our existing code. I want to start fresh with new styles and new HTML code. CSS3 gradients also support transparency, which can be used to create fading effects with our colors. To add transparency, we use the RGBA function to define the color stop. So I'm getting away from now my hexadecimal values and colors, and now I'm going to use the red, green, blue alpha function to define the color stops. The last parameter in the RGBA function can be a value from 0 to 1, because that's our alpha, and it defines the transparency of the color. 0 indicates full transparency, 1 indicates full color, no transparency. So let's go, I'm going to show you some examples of using a linear gradient that starts from the left, it starts fully transparent, and transitions to a full color. So let's go ahead and pull in some HTML. I'm going to go ahead and put this right below there. Go ahead and pull out some of these blank spaces. Good time for you to go ahead and pause if you want to go ahead and type that in. I'm going to go back here and reload example 6. Save my changes, reload 6, there we go. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type in that HTML code. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and put in my gradients inside my style like we've been doing in the past. And now I want to go ahead and clean these up, because I actually want to make certain that you can read this on one line before I pause it. So I'm going to go ahead and expand my text editor out just a little bit so we get everything on a single line so it's easier for you to type if you're typing this in. Good time to pause if you're going to type this in, then I'll explain what we've got here. Okay, what I want you to understand is we're actually starting now from our left. That's why we're using the left keyword. It's starting from the left, and it's going to transition to the right. I'm using RGB, red, green, blue values, and an alpha value. So I'm going 255.00 for my color, and I've got full transparency, and I'm going to full color. That's why I'm ending with the 1. So if I save the change, refresh my browser window, and you'll see now we're starting out at full transparency, which is white, going to that solid color red. And again, it's because 255.00 is red inside RGB. That is a red color. If I wanted to make this a yellow color, it would be 255. And I can do the same thing. Although let's just change it on the one that we know that we're using. So let's make it yellow. So 255. And again, doing the same thing, I'm transitioning from fully transparent to fully opaque. I'm going to save the change, refresh the browser window, and now you'll see we go from fully transparent to a fully yellow color. There are all kinds of RGB color tables out there that you can use to get these color values from. But if you wanted to do transparencies with your gradients, you're going to need to use the RGB scale. And again, because we're using the left, we're going left. If I wanted this to be right, I could take this right. Could save the change. And again, I'm only modifying the one because I know this is the one we happen to be using for this particular exercise. If you're going to do this on your site and you're having back all the fallback code, make sure you do these changes to all of them or they're going to be different. We could refresh that browser window and now it's going to change how that transparency is or how it's viewed in 6. So I mean, there's a lot of different things that we can do here with these. It looks like obviously we weren't using that. We were using one of the fallback ones for this one because this linear gradient may not be. I'm using Opera, so let's go put it here. I might be using the fallback code on this one. I didn't know that. Save. No, I'm not. Okay. Got my code moved. But anyway, if you want to use the transparencies, you want to make certain that you use the RGB values because that alpha, you're going to actually need that alpha value to make those transparent. I could actually make this a steel blue if I wanted to by using 70, just as an example, another color, because I actually use steel blue a lot. 70, 130, 180 is the actual RGB values for steel blue. I'm going to change it on the one I know I'm using, so it's 70, 30, 180. Save the changes, refresh my browser window. I'm going to go ahead and just copy these to all 4 because obviously I'm doing something. I am missing something somewhere along the way. So I'm just going to put this in all 4 values. This way I know I've got it correct. Save those changes, refresh my browser window. And now I've lost my whole, I lost a semicolon this way. There we go. And I lost a semicolon there. Got to be careful when you're doing coding. And that's the steel blue transitioning from, again, fully transparent to fully opaque. So there's a lot of cool things that we can do, and transparency is another one of those things we can do as long as we use the RGB color values as we're assigning the linear gradient colors to our CSS3 code. All right, so the last thing I want to show you in the linear gradients before we actually get into the radials, and I think the radial gradients will be part 2 of this series because this has gotten longer than I thought it was going to be, is I want to show you how you can have repeating gradients on your page. So you could have actually a group of repeating gradients for a background. And actually I've done this a few times in some of my sites, so I wanted to go ahead and demonstrate this. I'm going to do a save as on this, example 7.html. I'm going to go ahead and pull out my styling. Let's go ahead and pull out the HTML code. And I'm going to go in my exercise files. I'm going to go ahead and grab this because you can actually repeat gradients, and it's kind of cool. It's something that we used to do with graphics. Now we can actually do it with CSS3. And again, we're actually right into the CSS3 gradients, linear gradient, the ability to repeat gradients. I've got my same div set up as we've had set up in the past. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. I'm going to go in here and load up example 7. Good time to pause if you want to type that in. And now I'm going to go ahead and add the styles that allow me to do the repeating gradient. And I'll explain these as soon as I get them in. So I'm going to go between the style tags inside the head section of my document. Again, I'm assigning a height, just as we had done in the past. I'm going to go ahead and stretch this out so these lines don't break, so it's easier for you to type. It's easier for you to see what you're typing if they're not broken. Go ahead and save the changes. Good time to pause if you want to pause. And you can see here what I've got is I've got a background with a repeating linear gradient, red, yellow, 10%, green, 20%. And it says repeating. And what it's doing, it's taking a percentage of the color. So I've got the red color, I've got a 10% yellow color, 20% green color, and it's repeating that over and over again in the space I've allotted inside the height of the element. So if I save all these changes and I refresh my browser window, you can see that inside the 200 pixel height, we've got these linear gradients that are repeating from our red, our yellow, and our green. And then it starts all over, red, yellow, green, red, yellow, green. And it would just do that for the entire distance that I've assigned the height of that element. If I gave the element 100 pixels, save the change, refresh the browser window, it's going to do the same thing now, but it's going to squish them down because now they've got to fit closer together in that 100 pixel space. So it actually allows you to have repeating gradients inside the space that you've assigned for your gradient. And there are times when we actually do use repeating gradients. I don't use them very often, but they do get used. So I think that's going to wrap up this portion of the tutorial. I think in part 2 we'll get into the radial gradients that are available in CSS3. I apologize for the length of this. I didn't know it was going to go that long, but I wanted to demonstrate all the different types of linear gradients that we can now use in CSS3 that at one time used to be pretty difficult to implement on our websites and now have become very easy to implement on our websites. So I hope you enjoyed it. Look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.